We, on Sunday mornings, are going through the New Testament book of James. So if you have a Bible, would you join me in James chapter 3 is where we left off last time at verse 13, James 3. And there's guys coming down the aisles right now with Bibles. If you need to borrow one, make sure you get one. We're going to cover a few verses here together. I want you to read it along with me, so just get their attention. They even marked the spot for you. So if you don't know the Bible, you can find your way to James chapter 3 fairly easily. Hey, I was listening to sports talk radio the other day, and I wouldn't recommend that, by the way, just as a side point. But this particular day was actually really cool because the subject turned away from sports to religion. And I was like, all right, this is going to be great, you know? And it's because one of the guys, there were two hosts, and one of them is Jewish, and he had taken Wednesday off because it was Yom Kippur, right? The Day of Atonement. And the other guy, the non-religious guy, Michael was his name, he was being critical of the Jewish guy, Peter, and giving him a hard time because Peter he said he was taking Yom Kippur off to sacrifice himself to God and to fast and to go to synagogue and the things that they do for that. But instead what he was doing is he was texting Michael and watching the games and eating, you know? And so Michael's giving Peter a hard time because of it, you know? And so Peter started to defend himself and say, well, to me, it's just a day of reflection. And so I'm reflecting on these things, you know, but just as a side note, that's not what the Day of Atonement is. Actually, what it is it's supposed to be a day of repentance of sin and seeking the Lord for the Jewish people. It actually pointed to Jesus Christ and our need for a Savior and his sacrifice for the world. That's what the Day of Atonement actually, you know, ultimately means. But he sees it as a day of reflection. And so he just, you know, took the day off work. And so Michael is calling him out on it on the air. And it was great, you know. And so, and this is what I wanted to get to. So Peter goes, what am I, supposed to take the scriptures literally? And Michael goes, yes, that's what religion is. And it was just awesome, you know, because I agree with him. And so does James, actually. You see, all through this, what we've been learning so far, he's been trying to get us Christians to make what we believe and what we do to be the same thing. Not just to agree with it, not just to read it, those are good, but to go and do it. That's who we're supposed to be. Otherwise, I mean, think about it. Otherwise, the faith that I talk about isn't real, and everybody knows it. So, how do we avoid that behavior? You know, how do we live like a genuine Christian? And on top of that, which we're going to see here, how do we get along with other people while we're doing it? Well, I called this section, Get Your Wisdom from God. That's the title, Get Your Wisdom from God. Because if you don't, you have to kind of make it up like the Peter guy, right? And we don't want to do that. At least I hope you don't. And actually, right here, I believe we're going to get the answer to one key question. And that is this: where does your wisdom come from? Where does your wisdom come from? Are you governed by worldly wisdom, or is it heavenly wisdom? Right? And if you don't know, you're going to find out today. At least I hope you will when we get through this. And I think it's even more importantly, not just to know that, but like, how do I make sure that I get this right in my life? And so, to me, this is such a helpful, practical thing for us today. You know, whether you're a parent or a ministry leader or a student or a business owner, whatever your sphere of life is, this is a practical way to know how to best get along with other people and to live a life that God calls you to. So we're going to look at two portraits here in just a few moments. But before we do look at these two portraits of two different kinds of people, because they get their wisdom from two different places, James is going to open us up with just kind of like an overview of wisdom and why it's important. So let's look at verse 13 together in James chapter 3. He said, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom." Okay, just a quick refresher. This was originally a letter that the half-brother of Jesus wrote to early Christians. And it's all about putting faith in action, right? And we've been talking about that in a variety of ways in these chapters so far, that the people with genuine faith in Jesus will actually show evidence of it in our life, that our actions and attitudes will prove that we are Christians. And so, all through this book, James has been doing what somebody said, he's putting our faith on trial. And he really has. It kind of pokes at you a little bit, doesn't it? Like makes you go, am I doing what I believe? Am I doing what I say? You know, last week, in the first part of the chapter, we learned along with Pastor Bill to watch what we say. You guys remember that? If you were here, watch it on social media. Watch what we say. That you know, our mouths, our tongue was the focus last time. It can either be a blessing or a curse, right? Depending upon where it's coming from. And so Bill urged us to give, you know, the Lord control over our words, because that's what James was urging us to do. Well, now he's turned our attention towards how we live. So it's more like what we say before. Now, in this part, it's how we live. Our conduct. He uses that word there, did you see, in verse 13, conduct. So the idea is like, what kind of wisdom is building your character? What kind of wisdom is building my character? So that's kind of like the intro part. And so that's why he says there in verse 13, all right, so how many of you guys are wise? Got any wise guys here? How many of you are wise? Now, what do you think about when you talk about, when you think, or let me say it a different way. What do you imagine when you think about a wise person? Maybe it was a grandfather you had, or just somebody who's... I always think of like an old man up on a mountain that knows a lot of stuff, you know, like Yoda or somebody like that. That's like sometimes. But James wants us to try and see it more like everybody has wisdom of some sort, and it comes out in how we live day to day based on what you know and believe. And so that's a different way to think about it, you know. We all have wisdom input and output. And you know, this is such a good subject because some people can be really smart but not be able to manage their own lives. Or they have a destructive influence on others because of the input. So James is urging us to humbly seek out wisdom from God. That's your safe place. And you know, Solomon did that. You guys that know your Old Testament, you know that Solomon, when he became king of Israel, you know, he was King David's son, or one of David's sons, and he became king, and the Lord spoke to him and said, "Ask me for anything and I will give it to you." How would you like God to ask you that question? Right? Ask me anything. What would you ask for if he asked you that? Would you ask for a long life, maybe? Or to be rich? You know, retire on a beach someplace? Some people might ask for those things. You know what Solomon asked for? Wisdom. And because of that, God blessed his life in all sorts of ways through it. And it was so important to him that he actually wrote one of the books of the Bible that's all about wisdom. Well, he wrote most of Proverbs, which is the book of wisdom. And actually, he urges us throughout that to get wisdom from God. In chapter 4 of Proverbs, he tells us that we're supposed to embrace God's wisdom, that if we do, it'll bring us honor. And he said, he will place it on your head like a crown. It'll be an ornament of grace in your life. And that's such an awesome thing to think of. And he should know because God did that for him. And he wants to do it for you, too. You see, this subject is so practically important because wisdom from God is what enables us to relate God's truth into our daily life. So you can imagine the benefits to know God's wisdom and to use it would have in your day-to-day life. Which is why, if you go back one more time to verse 13, James says that wisdom from above, produces good conduct. This is the only thing that does produce good conduct. And so the idea here is that the manner in which you live shows if you're wise in the Lord or not. Because our conduct is the proof. You know, we live in a society that does not really look at outcomes as proof of whether something is good or not, but God does. The outcome is very important to him. And so, godly wisdom. Now, as I said, we're going to look at two portraits here in the rest of our time together. It's really, we're looking at two kinds of wisdom, and James is going to, paint a picture of what both looks like. Because there's only two kinds of wisdom. Wisdom is sort of like coffee. There's only two varieties, right? You got decaf and fully leaded, right? Coffee. Well, in wisdom, it's either worldly, from beneath, or heavenly, from God. Right? One it comes from one of two places. And so James is going to help us determine where ours is coming from. Because in order for me to get along with you, for us to get along with one another, and to live a life that's consistent with our faith, the origin of our wisdom has to be from the right place. So we're going to test it now. And as I said, we'll look at two different portraits. Portrait number 1 begins in verse 14, and I call this portrait of a troublemaker. Portrait of a troublemaker is the result of when wisdom is from below, worldly wisdom. And we'll see what the characteristics of that is. Verse 14, he says, "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth." Okay, James is going to list 7 characteristics here of worldly wisdom. Basically, this is what happens if that's the origin, if it's from beneath. And I'm just going to take you through them and explain them a little bit as we go, not take too much time on each one, but just so that we know what this means. So the first one there is what? Did you see that? It's envy. Envy, right? Wisdom from below causes us to want what other people have. Now, some people might not think this is a big deal. Who cares what if I say I want that guy's house? What's the big deal about that? Well, it's actually way worse than people think because of what it can springboard to much worse things. You know, if you get a chance, and I'm going to refer to the Old Testament several times today. I think I already have, but, when you go through the book of the Kings, the first and second Kings, first and second Chronicles, there is so much envy in there where the kings of the world or some of the kings of Israel wanted something, and it caused them to do horrible things in order to get it. Right, so it can lead to much worse things. And then you move to the New Testament, and Mark tells us in his gospel that Pilate, the governor in that region in that day, knew that the priests were wanting to put Jesus to death because of envy. You see, Jesus had gotten so much popularity amongst the common people that the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, they hated him because of the notoriety, and one of the reasons why they put him to death was because of envy, right? And so the Lord wants us to be aware of that. And if I get my wisdom from the world, I am going to be an envious person. And the way to spot it is if a person is jealous of what other people have. I want what they have. I was looking on Craigslist the other day, and I think Facebook Marketplace, you guys look around at those, and you can find used stuff. And I was looking for a used chainsaw. And I was noticing as I was going through it, you got to be careful because there's so much stuff, and it can just start to suck you in. Have you ever been there? Like, all of a sudden I'm looking for a chainsaw, and I'm like, ooh, a boat. Or big flat screen, or oh, I wish I had a hot tub. I never thought about a hot tub before that moment, right? And it's kind of funny but it can start to plant this seed of discontentment. Well, I don't have a hot tub, that kind of thing. And so in our brains, we are made in the image of God, and our brains will begin to figure out a way to change our circumstances. And I'm not supposed to be led that way. Envy can cause all kinds of trouble, right? Where I just need to seek the Lord and let him give me what he wants to give me. So envy, he says, beware of that. That's worldly wisdom. Self-seeking is the second one. If you have a study Bible, it might say selfish ambition. And that helps me a little bit understand it more. It's that desire to get ahead of everybody else. And how much of that goes on with the world system, You just got to get rid of those who oppose you or disagree with you. It's that mentality of, I must win. I must be right. I must have the last word. And boy, social media is all about that, isn't it? I like Twitter for some things, and some things I hate it. And one of the things I hate about Twitter is like some people just got to keep hammering their point and have the last word, And that comes right from worldly ambition, because that person's main passion is to advance their own interests. But that's not necessary for Christians to embrace that way. There's a really good short chapter in the Old Testament. If you get a chance to read it later today, it's Jeremiah 45. And in this chapter, what happens is Jeremiah has a friend that in the ministry named Baruch. And Baruch apparently was frustrated with his life in the ministry. And it seems like he was kind of reacting badly towards others because he didn't feel like that he was getting enough from God, right? And so he was starting to seek it for himself. And so the Lord, in his grace, gave a word for Jeremiah just for his buddy. And I'm paraphrasing it because I don't have it open here in front of me. But he said, don't seek great things for yourself. You're going to mess everything up, man. Just trust me. Just seek me, and I will do something for you. And that is such a blessing. And that's the way he is towards us, too. It's unnecessary for our own greatness to be our motive. God will do the promoting. Just let him do it. Don't seek after wisdom from beneath. Now, keep in mind, you guys, that James is writing to believers here. That's the primary audience. And so what that means, if you think about it, is that it's very possible for Christian servants to get their wisdom from the world and end up bitter or jealous of others serving with them. And I'm of the belief that we often serve in ministry together just to help get this out of us. Because until you serve God in the trenches with others, often you don't even really have to deal with this kind of stuff that's going on. I mean, he can do it other ways, but I think that's a primary way that God roots it out of us. And so here's how to find out if you're self-seeking, is ask yourself, do I want the attention? Do I have to have the last word? Stuff like that. Well, next, number 3 is boasting. Boasting. Do you see that one? And often it seems like that wisdom from below reveals itself in being a critic. Because a critic is a critic because they think that what they think and the way that they do it is better than everybody else's way, right? That's why they're critical. And the proof to them is look how poorly everybody else is doing it. Right? So if they were only more like me, look how groovy it would be, And then they start to run down other people so that their ways look better. And this is all wisdom from beneath. So watch out, because big critics, it's not wisdom from God. Well, the next characteristic of a troublemaker there is, did you see that? Deny the truth or lie against the truth. People do this all the time to get what they want. They'll ignore what God has said, but I don't care what that said. This is what I'm doing, And so what James is letting us all know is that if I lie against the truth of God, then my instruction is not coming from God. And it doesn't matter how many times I justify it, it's not from him. I denied the truth. So that's a lot of stuff there. I mean, imagine what the damage that those 4 behaviors can do in a family or in a ministry. And he's not done yet. There's more. He's actually going to cover 3 more. Let's look at verse 15 together. He says, this wisdom, does not descend from above, but is what? Earthly, sensual, demonic. Okay, so this kind of wisdom he's talking about, it doesn't originate with God. It's a different kind of wisdom. So it is a type of wisdom, just the wrong kind. He tells it comes from 3 other places. It comes from the world, right? The worldly system. It comes from the flesh, our sinful nature, and the devil. So this is a bad thing. And I just wanted to touch on those 3 here briefly before we move on. First, he said earthly. Earthly. Earthly would be, one example would be something that people produce apart from God's will. And again, going back to the Old Testament, a prime example of that is in Genesis 11 when they made the Tower of Babel. Do you guys remember that? Because God had said to those people who were repopulating the earth after the flood, he told them to go and fill the earth, multiply and be fruitful. And what they decided to do is they were all going to stay together in one place. And they said this, we want to make a name for ourselves. You see, what was happening is they're resisting what God told them to do, and they decided we're going to do it our own way instead. And that's earthly. Earthly is to govern ourselves by things other than what God has said. Maybe we govern ourselves by emotion or logic, where we're like Spock. It's like, I'm all logical or whatever, And the world does this all the time. And I would point to one horrible thing in our culture as earthly like this, and that's abortion. The way that our culture embraces this horrible thing is an earthly wisdom. This is not God's will for our world. Logic and emotion says, well, you can't just have all these teenage pregnancies running around, all these babies, and so let's make it, a pragmatic way to deal with it. Like, are you kidding me? This is the worst smudge in our nation's history, probably. Well, one of them, if not the worst. All because it's just earthly, worldly wisdom, and it destroys people. And I'm not coming down on you if that's in your past. God can forgive all sorts, any kind of wrongdoing. But let's not say that it's a good thing and it's of the Lord. Sensual was the next one that he pointed out there. Sensual. I kept thinking of the word carnal when I was reading this, because it's like if something appeals primarily to the carnal side of us, then that it denies the truth, right? And if that's what's happening in a situation, then we ought to watch out, And, some people will embrace a particular religion or a system of theology because it appeals to their carnal nature. Like they're looking for something so they don't have to change and they can just be more of themselves, I think of Islam as an example of this. Islam is a controlling religion. And I think that some people embrace it because of that, And it's sensual, it's carnal, because it appeals to our carnal nature. It's not from above. It's worldly. It's from beneath. The last one that he points out here, number 7 in our list of 7 characteristics, is it's demonic. Demonic is that one. And, it shouldn't be a shocker to us that the devil has access to all the same things that we do. Music and books and websites and things, I believe, and again, this is written mostly towards Christians, I believe that the enemy is trying to be your mentor. He can't rob you of your eternal glory, but he can certainly influence you into worldliness. And I mean, don't you think that he is just all out to destroy us through things that we enjoy? Things that in and of themselves are not bad? Here's a good question I try to ask myself, and I'm not perfect at this, but a question I try to ask myself is, if I'm going to watch a movie, for example, I try to think, where is the wisdom in that thing coming from, right? Because then it helps me make decisions more. And, again, I don't always choose right, but I think it helps because I don't want the devil to mentor me. I want godly influence in my life, in my kids' life, my wife, and this church. So, where's the wisdom in that coming from? Now, the summary here in verse 16 tells us where it all leads to, and it's not any better. Look at verse 16. He says, "For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there." Wow. So how do you tell if wisdom is from God or not? Well, what's the result? Is it disorder and evil practices? If so, then it's not. And he uses that word there. You might want to circle it. He uses that word confusion, right? Because I think that's a really helpful word. The world is out for itself and it's confused. I mean, look how agitated everybody is, And it's been going on for a long time. I remember when I was a young man in the 80s, there was a song, a rock song, I think it was Love and Rockets, and it was Ball of Confusion. If you guys remember that song, Ball of Confusion. And through this song, they kind of rap these lyrics talking about confusing things. And how everything's confusing, and then the chorus is kind of like, well, that's what the world is today. Hey, hey, and the band played on. That's how they, it's like they got no solution to the problem. They just point out what it is, and because it is a ball of confusion, right? Because of worldly wisdom, the wisdom from beneath, and so everybody's just running around looking out for themselves. What do you expect is going to happen here? So that's all the bad news. But not so among Christians. And that's the whole point that he's getting at here. And you know what? Here's why it's not so among Christians. And I want to show you 1 Corinthians 14:33. Here's what Paul the Apostle said. And maybe we could all read this out loud together as a church. He said, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints." That's good news right there. He's not the author of confusion. The enemy is. The world, flesh. You see, that verse actually in context is talking about spiritual gifts being used in the church and how God wants all believers to participate, but he doesn't want us to seek our own glory while we're doing it. Because when we do, it causes disruption and confusion. But the good news is that God's Spirit never promotes selfish ambition and confusion, but it promotes peace. It's such a blessing. Sometimes I like to take the verses that I read and kind of restate them another way to help me apply it easier, better with my life. And if I go back to verse 16 with you, you could say this verse another way. You could say, where there are people in the church who are jealous and selfish, there is disorder in the fellowship, and people do all kinds of bad things. You see what that does? It brings it nearby. It's not like, well, it's out there somewhere. We don't have to worry about that. Well, not really. It can be right here, and it could be me. So, there's the portrait of the troublemaker. Do you see yourself in it at all? A couple of things, maybe a lot. James sketched it out for us. Let me just quickly review the list for you, because there are things to watch out for. Things like if we live for ourselves only. That's wisdom from below. Or being contentious or harsh or stubborn. Unforgiving. Who wants all that? Well, that's what you get with worldly wisdom. It's the output. So, how do we make sure that we get this right? How do we get along with one another? Well, he tells us next. He says to get our wisdom from heaven. So in part 2 now, we're going to look at a portrait of a peacemaker. So we looked at the portrait of a troublemaker. So now he's going to sketch out this portrait of a peacemaker. And it's because this is wisdom that comes from heaven, godly wisdom. And here's what he said in verse 17. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, and then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Okay, so there's 7 things here that are the result or characteristics of wisdom from above. This is what it's going to produce. Godly wisdom. It's a contrast. We had the 7 bad ones before, and now here's 7 good ones. So again, I want to just take you through these characteristics here, and it's to help us decide where the origin of our wisdom, right? And I'm going to ask a question after each one, just briefly, to help us to apply it a little bit. So first, he starts off with pure. Pure. Is it pure? There is a lot of pressure to destroy your purity. And I'm not just talking about sexual purity, although that could be part of it. I think that what he's mostly focused on here is that the wisdom from God shouldn't be mixed with earthly wisdom, because that will dilute the purity. Where's your counsel coming from? Is your counsel from the Lord, from his word, the Holy Spirit, other believers who are out for your best interests? Or is it coming from somewhere else? Is it pure? He also says it's peaceable. It's peaceable there in verse 17. You make peace through heavenly, godly wisdom, not worldly. We already looked at that. Remember, what does worldly wisdom produce? Confusion, agitation. God wants people to have peace between them. And God's wisdom spreads peace, actually. So then we're not out looking for a fight. Do you know that some folks go on social media just looking for a fight? And they say it's of the Lord. Well, that kind of wisdom is not from God, no matter what's said or how we justify it. James said we should seek peace as long as it doesn't sacrifice purity. So the question is, Does God's peace rule your heart? If not, then I'm probably getting my wisdom from elsewhere. Pure, peaceable. Number 3 here is gentleness. Gentleness. Wisdom that comes from above is not strict. And we know that because God said that you believers are not under the law, you're under grace. God's poured out his grace upon you so then you can give away grace. You can respond gently. A gentle person getting their wisdom from above will take other people's feelings into consideration. We'll try to see their point of view, We ask ourselves, how do we respond to other people? Have you guys ever done this? Like someone will text you and it'll make you a little mad. And so you start to oh. And then before you hit send, you go, backspace, 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 backspace. You guys ever done that? I've done this with my wife a few times, she'll say something and then I'm like, where's that coming from? I'm not going to say that to her. The Lord wants us to be gentle in our response. Willing to yield is number 4. I think this might be one of the most awesome things that comes from God's wisdom, and that's the willingness to listen to what someone else has to say. The willingness to change, to have an open mind when we're wrong, not to be a stubborn person. I wanted to tell you a quick story about a guy in our church, Danny. He's one of our part-time staff guys here. He manages our radio station. And I asked him ahead of time if I could tell the story, and he said I could. So here goes. But I can't remember when it was exactly. It was about a year ago. And somebody came up to me during the week. And during the week, there's not a lot of people here, just a few of us typically. But somebody came up to me and goes, hey, did you know that Danny is open carrying here at church at work? He's got a pistol on his hip. And I go, no, I didn't know that. And then I started to think, did we say anything about that in the employee manual? Do we open carry here? And I couldn't remember if we said anything. I don't think we did. So I'm okay, that's kind of interesting. I wonder what's up with that. So I just looked for an opportunity to talk to him. I think I was walking out of the church or walking in the next day maybe, and Danny is in the welcome center. Right? And so I walk up, and it's just him, and I walk up, and he's got his the holster and the gun right there on his hip. And in the welcome center, mind you, and I go, hey, so I see you're carrying. And he's like, yep, it's my constitutional right. Or I forget exactly how he said it. You'll have to correct me, Danny, about that. But, America. No, he didn't say that. And I go, well, so you're here working at the church during the day, and you're just carrying that around. And he goes, well, it's my right. I can do that. I go, well, sure. Yeah, you could do that. I go, but is that the best thing that you could be doing here in the welcome center? Because it's supposed to, people are going to think you're going to draw on them when they come to the welcome center, So, could you just consider this? Maybe this isn't the place for that, right? I'd just like for you to consider that. And I don't know exactly what happened, but we split apart there. And I thought I heard, he'll have to correct me, but I think he got upset. Well, I know he got upset, and I think he left the building. And he was kind of stormed off and had to go think about this. And so I just prayed for him, just prayed for the Lord to do something here. What's the right thing to do here, God? And then I think it was later that night, maybe the next day, Danny calls me. And he's like, you know what, man, you're right. You're right. I don't have to do that, even though technically I could. I care more about what God is doing, and I yield to, basically I yield to what, you had talked to me about, and I changed my mind, so I'm not gonna do that. You see, God's wisdom does not produce rigid people. It just doesn't. You see, one of the key components of being a follower of Jesus is this: are you willing to change? You see, Danny's a follower of Jesus, and so he was willing to change in that moment. And we're all confronted with different ways of, am I willing to change? Because really, my faith goes no place if I'm not willing to change. So if you and I, if we come to the scriptures and we hear a message and we always are thinking of, well, that person needs to hear that, but I'm fine. That's a problematic attitude to have. So the question to ask is, am I unreasonable? Am I stubborn? Are you willing to listen? So number 5 here is full of mercy. Full of mercy. What does that look like? Full of mercy. Well, I think a big part of this is if you know somebody who's really screwed up, really fallen because of sin, or just messed things up, and what's your response to that? You just go, it was just a matter of time before he did that. Or you try to help build them up. Be compassionate and kind towards them. You see, a godly wise person will see the needs of someone and be merciful to them. Here's a test for it. Is your first response when you see one of these situations, how can I extend mercy to that person? If it is, then you're getting godly wisdom. If it isn't, then you're probably not. Full of mercy. Number 6 is without partiality. So, you don't play favorites. Wisdom from above doesn't play favorites because God doesn't play favorites. See, you're not out to gain people on your side. Sometimes, even in the church, we can start to I want people on my side of the argument kind of a thing. Well, when I was reading this, what the Lord convicted me of is I should want people on God's side, even if it's not my side. Without partiality. And then the last one here is without hypocrisy. Without hypocrisy. So that would be, sincere and genuine. You're not pretending. You say one thing and do another, like the guy on the radio, Without hypocrisy. Straight shooter. I probably shouldn't say shoot after using that example. Verse 17 describes to me what Jesus looks like. And that should be our aim. One of the booklets that we have out at our Welcome Center is written by this guy named Jim. And he said, I don't think it's in one of the booklets, I think I heard it from him separately, but he said that whenever someone tries to get me to adopt their theology or their way of doing things, I always ask the question, will it make me more like Jesus? And that's how and then if it will, then maybe that's what I should be doing. And if it doesn't, then I don't. And that's a kind of a good filter to run it through there. So these are the things that godly wisdom produces, at least the list that James has given us, what it does. And so here's the portrait that he's made here. We can imagine it's a gentle person who thinks others have much value and doesn't pretend to be something that they're not. And it's a person who's easy to reason with and quick to forgive and shows kindness, not stubborn, right? And you know why? Because their wisdom is from above. And so it's the best place to be. And I pray that that's where we would live, receiving that wisdom from God. Well, as we finish up today, I'm going to invite the worship team back up for one last song. And maybe we could read verse 18 and then we'll close. He said, "Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace." If you have an ESV Bible, it says harvest of righteousness. I like that. It's like I am going to have a big haul of God's wisdom if I pay attention to this and actually try to apply this to my life. It's so hopeful to me. Did you see where he said if there's godly character and conduct, what the key element is going to be in your life? You know what that is? It's peace. Peace. He says it twice in case you weren't paying attention. God wants us to be peacemakers, church. And I can't do it if I'm guided by worldly wisdom. You see, he wants to do something great with you, in your life and with your life. I love this verse from Psalm 85:10. I wanted to show it to you. Psalm 85:10, it says, "Mercy and truth have met together. Righteousness and peace have kissed." Isn't that sweet how that's said there? Just putting them together. That's what he's doing here in James chapter 3. You know, he's saying that wisdom from God is going to empower us to promote peace and help people reconcile and bring a big haul to God, a harvest to him. Now, if you're convinced today that you want more wisdom, it's easy to get. Back in chapter 1, God said, just ask him. Just ask for wisdom. And he said that he will give it to you liberally. Right? So if you want it, go get it, because he'll give it to you. And I pray that that's a pursuit of yours, that you would just say, Lord, will you give me the wisdom to navigate this life in a way that honors you? And he will, because he loves to do those things. So what did you guys decide from this Bible study? Are you a troublemaker or are you a peacemaker? You know, maybe you're a peacemaker who's got a little few points of trouble going on there. And that's okay. I found some stuff I got to deal with here going through that. But, you know, you can tell who's getting their instructions from God and who is it, because you can see in what they do. And we're not perfect. We're learning. We're following. And so maybe a couple things reminded you to make sure you get your wisdom from God. And lastly, I'll finish with this. But maybe you're not a peacemaker. Maybe you saw, reading through this, something is really wrong, and you need some help. I'm here to tell you that you, my friend, can have peace with God right now. You can have peace with God, you can have peace with others, and just as important, you can have peace within yourself. The war will be over, and it's up to you. God draws people to himself, wants you to put your trust in his son, Jesus. Ask for forgiveness, and he will forgive you. And you believe on God's son, he will make you free. It's the greatest news ever, and that's why he sent his son to earth, so you and I could be free, and the war would be over. We would have peace with God, internal, and peace with our brothers and sisters. And I pray that's what will happen to you. I'm going to pray for you in just a moment. And as we sing this last song, would you guys stand with me? And we'll sing together, worship God, and then I'll come back up and we'll pray and be dismissed, okay?